Guerrilla Radio. Slava Ukraini.
I was picking the scabs off Mikhail Khodorkovsky's thing the other day in relation to the oil business, just on some factual clarification things. But I also just wanted to point out that he, even though he has denounced Putin and he's living in exile and all that, they still have an incredibly difficult time, some Russians do, for going that final step in the epiphany and saying what needs to happen right now is we need to stop this war and get the fuck out of Ukraine in its entirety, right? They've got to be willing to make a commitment in free will like that openly, and if they can't do that, they're still not on our sides. You know, Gary Kasparov would do it. There are others who actually have made that step. They wouldn't be the first one, but I'll tell you, there's very few of these people inside Russia, soldiers, propagandists, and all these things, who might be pointing out the truth, might be saying the quiet part out loud, and might be using some of the classic Russian means of communicating their true feelings, but stating it painfully and directly that this war's got to end and we've got to get the hell out of Ukraine in total, because it was an absolute horrific, terrible mistake. And then hopefully, if they go beyond that, they say, and it's one we're never going to make again because we're done being imperialistic colonizers and genociders, right? Recognize how bad you are and make a commitment to stop doing it anymore is the bare minimum. And we don't see that from people. And I'm telling you, I'm saying this to you now because there's multiple of these people getting platformed, like by The Economist, this oligarch that they put out, that are not our friends, right? They haven't made that commitment in free will yet to say we've got to stop this war and get out of it. They talk about ending the war, but they never talk about it in detail. And if you do get into the detail, it's always ending it on Russia's terms, or that you've got to stop the war because the world can't afford for Russia to break up, or that they've got nuclear weapons and that's scary. All the things that are happening now, that you will see this oligarch and many others start lining up. They're not your friend, like Alexei Navalny isn't or wasn't, unless they make that full commitment to representative government in their own country, and stopping the colonization and genocide of their neighbors. That if they're not willing to commit that we need to get out of Ukraine in total, they're not your friend yet, and you have every right to still press them to do the right thing. And people who are ready to let Russia off the hook are going to become my severe enemy here as we move through the final phases of this war. Do not let Russia off the hook, especially if you love Russia, if you think Russia deserves to exist as a country and might have a future, then the only and best thing that can happen to them is an absolutely humiliating defeat in this war, and going home with their tails between their legs and being isolated until such time as they meet the conditions of reentry to polite society, like turning over all the war criminals for adjudication, like paying reparations to Ukraine, and absolutely first off the block, finding and returning all the stolen children. Bare minimum, folks. Those aren't the 1991 territories and those things I just set up above. Those are just the things that you need to do in order to be recognized as a human being. So that's the starter for what's absolutely necessary as a result to close out this war. But I would argue there are a lot of other things that Russia should do before I'd be willing to let them off the hook. And that in particular is not not making preparations and mental states, which mean that it's definitely going to happen again. I would want, as part of an armistice they signed with me over this war, if I had any say about it, to demand that Russia rewrite its textbooks under international oversight and then have to reteach, start teaching actual history to high school students and stop living in this altered reality that we see presented by Russians like Patrushev, that are still claiming that Ukraine's not a valid country, that it doesn't have a right to exist. That or Putin, his plan for what's going to happen is he is either going to take all of Ukraine, or he's going to take the part which he has identified, and the rest of the Ukraine is not going to remain sovereign. It's going to do his bidding, or else they're going to get another invasion. That's the position they're still at. So there's no reason to let these assholes off the hook right just yet. No reason whatever. And there will not be a reason to let them off the hook unless they're willing to make a commitment in free will that we've got to get out of Ukraine. We've got to stop this war and get out of Ukraine, bare minimum, and then we can start to talk about where else they're willing to go. But if it's not going to go to having a representative government inside Russia, the whole thing should be allowed to just collapse and die. Russia is the uh, non-essential country. It's non-essential. There is no good reason Russia has to stay together as one big entity. There is no reason that we can't embargo it all, 100% of everything. No food, no water, no medicine, no resources, no culture, no sport, no nothing. Russia could be completely embargoed because it's self-sufficient for what its needs are, and there's nothing it produces that's absolutely essential to the world. The rest of the world can get along just fine, even though it's that big carved out chunk of the world up there at the top. Doesn't make any difference. It's not unique and special. And that right there, that's kind of the message that Russia needs to get. You're just another country. You're not unique and special, and the world can live without you. You are the inessential country. If you'd like to join voluntarily as just another country in a couple of generations, we'll be happy to let you back, provided you can demonstrate that you've got a government that is using the vast resources of that chunk of land that you hold for the benefit of your population generally, and that you're no longer interested in being an intimidatory and predatory neighbor to those who are around you. That's where we ought to go. Russia can be isolated. We can do without Russia. And I'm not saying I want to. I'm not saying genocide Russia or invade it and eliminate them all. I'm not saying the things Russia says. I'm just saying make them be apart from the world until they demonstrate that they're ready to be a part of the world again. And they're going to have to pay some dues to get there. But those dues, while they may seem incredibly burdensome to any Russian or people who are sympathetic to the Russians, I can guarantee you are not at all either unnecessary or overburdensome, because they owe Ukraine more than they will ever be able to repay Ukraine. There is no way we're ever going to see all these children that they've stolen ever again back in Ukrainian families. It's just not going to happen. It's not possible. They won't even find them all. It's not possible to repay Ukraine or the world for the execution of prisoners of war and the basically ubiquitous torture of POWs and civilians that are captured by Ukraine. They'll never repay for all that pain and suffering. Never. They'll never pay for the full cost of their chemical warfare that have gone more than 10,000 uses of in this war. They'll certainly never recover the cost in total for the Novokakhovka Dam and all the environmental and economic damage done due to that. They won't ever recover that stuff. So they have to absolutely recover the things that they can recover from Russia in this war as a bare minimum. Not There won't be any concessions on the basics. The basics, all the 1991 territory back, all the war criminals sent for identification and adjudication, all, all the uses of chemical weapons, execution of prisoners of war, and mass torture of and medical inappropriate medical torture of POWs and civilians by Russia. If they're not punished for these war crimes, then they'll happen again. So it's not a concession for Ukraine to say, oh, we can give this up. They can't give that up. In fact, the world can't give up the prosecution of war crimes. And there, under no circumstances can we ever say that a country can go to war against another country, steal that country's children, and not have every one of those returned, along with other reparations they should pay. I don't know what the value of the reparations are. I don't know how long Russia would have to pay them. I guarantee you, we could set up a system where Russia shares its absolute incredible natural wealth, the profits from its incredible natural wealth, not with a few hundred people at the top of the Russian society, but with the society more broadly in Russia, rebuild a society that you'd want to live in, that people want to have children in, and have ample money left over to pay for the damages they've done in Ukraine over time. It could be done equitably, but it's probably not ever going to happen. So the things that Ukraine has already given up and won't ever in this war are concessions enough. Concessions enough. Now let's not talk anymore about concessions Ukraine will make in order to have this war concluded. It's now time to talk about only concessions that Russia will make in order to end this war and return to polite society sometime, and what you're willing to do to get there. Because, like I talked about personal donations as we started off, it's absolutely essential that every country right now, if you're a real, true ally of Ukraine, give them absolutely everything that they ask you for, or that you know you've got that they could use in this war to finish it quickly. Finish it quickly, meaning finish Russia quickly. Make sure that Russia can't get any supplies to its troops at the front line. Make sure that Russia's economy suffers maximally so that it goes into collapse sooner. Make sure that every humanitarian aid and support can be given to Ukraine so that minimize the death and discomfort of them in, because this war ain't over. This is the thing, the urgency here. This war ain't anywhere near over, and Russia is an atrocity a day machine. So making sure that maximum pressure is put on Russia, maximum pressure on Russia, and no discussion of any concessions with Russia for Russia at all. No, none of this. Oh, we've got to keep them in the world because they got nukes, folks. We lived through the Soviet Union. When the Soviet Union broke up, by my recollection, there were 4 countries that received nuclear weapons as a result of that breakup. And guess what? The world lived through it. In fact, there was no major scare about somebody using a nuclear weapon during the dissolution of the Soviet Union and it going to its place. Governments, like the government that I remember at the time in America, were trying to keep it very quiet, in fact, while they went about trying to make sure all the nuclear weapons were consolidated in one location and were still abiding by the treaties that the previous Soviet Union had put in place, right? Back when there used to be a responsible U.S. administration that didn't have to try to, trumpet every success and was willing to have successes that nobody would ever find out about for 20 or 50 years, right? Responsible government people. I know it sounds like it's fantasy at this point, but we've gone through this before. Don't let anybody tell you that we got to be scared. This is another step of escalation management. We can't let Russia break up because it'll be all too scary. The only scary part about Russia breaking up, if that happened as a result of economic collapse and social disorder and political chaos because Putin died or needed to be removed, if Russia collapses and breaks up, it'll go from being the one inessential country to 57, and Jenny's grandkids will have to learn a whole lot more capitals in order to pass the geography test. That is the only bad thing that realistically happened, because nobody in the component parts of a country that breaks up from Russia, if they're holding nuclear weapons, they will not be let's say they were located where they're at right now and they just end up inside the republics they're currently sitting inside, and they all break up into their independent oblasts. Then we got like 89 countries. Well, they aren't going to break up quite that many, and there's still only going to be about, I don't know, a dozen that will have possession at the time of nuclear weapons. That's nuclear weapons in the form of warheads that are in deep storage, that haven't been removed, and probably need to go to a maintenance and assembly area that isn't even in their oblast. So they probably don't have all the parts to put together a ballistic missile and deliver it to somebody. But there's those nuclear weapons, the 4,000 nuclear warheads that Russia maintains, will remain in deep storage where they were when the Soviet Union broke up. And there will be agreements put in place with the people who hold those by serious people who are worried about nuclear detente, that they will also, just like they did when the Soviet Union broke up, go into safe hands until that country either decides they're going to keep holding them. Because remember, holding nuclear weapons is an incredibly, phenomenally expensive task that needs lots and lots of maintenance and security. And I'll bet there's tons of countries that don't have any, tons of provinces in Russia that would have neither the interest or the means in holding nuclear weapons, much like Ukraine didn't at the time. But whoever gives up nuclear weapons at that time should get some security guarantees. And that's exactly some real security guarantees. But this is not unthinkable for Russia to break up. If you're worried about nuclear weapons, that's good. Keep your focus on nuclear weapons, and you can critique the manner in which they are secured after those countries break up, or maybe what they're worth. Because here's the, most of these places, if Russia broke up into its component parts, wouldn't be able to afford maintenance, and wouldn't have an interest in a nuclear weapon. Yakutia, for instance, ain't going to want them, but I'll bet they'll be glad to sell them to the United States or another nuclear power like France to get them out of their hands and get some aid and support for what's going to be an incredibly difficult period of time, getting out of the hole that Russia's put you in. Because guess what? Every one of those component part countries, if it all breaks up into bits, is going to own their tiny percentage of the reparations that are still due to Ukraine. Yeah, yeah, they are. Because everybody who lives in Russia across the entire country needs to own what they've done. They own the Russian government. I didn't vote them in, they did. I don't live in that location. They do. They need to. I can't understand. This is Trump, and the Republicans would accept this, as well as liberals. You own what your government does on your behalf, and you got to pay the piper when it turns out to be absolute dog shit. And this one's absolute dog shit. You've paid. They know what they're paying now, right? They know when they stand in gasoline lines. They know that Putin's broken the social contract with them. They know their government's becoming more intrusive and repressive and all the things that they wanted out of their life if they just turned over power to Putin. Well, they've made a terrible, terrible deal, is what they did. And as that comes home to roost to them, they need to recognize that and be willing to work away from that. But part of working away from that is going to be paying the piper for letting it happen in the first place, because you are responsible. If you were in Russia from 1991 through 2008, or sorry, 2000, I don't know. Yeah, 8, when he took over the second time, when power got really consolidated, there was still some time to affect things in that time. And I talked to dozens of Russians when I was in Russia in the 2000 early 2000s about why aren't you politically engaging here, and not a single one of them would ever be they weren't interested. They were buying into the social contract. Buying in voluntarily to the social contract means you owe the price of that contract. And the price of that contract is your country has done genocide and billions and trillions of dollars of damage in Ukraine. And there's no getting, and a whole bunch of war crimes along the way. And there is no getting away from that. So if there's a cost to be paid for that, you owe your portion. You do. And I do not want to see. Well, we need to be vigilant and fight back from anybody who says or publishes anything that says this garbage that's now come out from The Economist, that they allowed this guy this oligarch to put together this false argument about how Russia was essential and we couldn't let it fail and that we don't want to let it slip into the hands of the Chinese. And they don't want to pay the piper for any of the things they've done. If Russia becomes a vassal state in order to stay together as a country, they did that to Russia. Or I didn't do it. They did it. They sold themselves into Russian slavery, not me. And they will have to pay the piper for that. That is very possibly one of the things that will cause the country to break up, I suggest. But this guy laying this thing out like there's 4 or 5 things that can happen, or you have to accept Russia as this. He defines sovereignty as this major power that's too big to fail. It's never going away, and you have to give it its due, right? None of that is true. Russia is the non-essential country. There is nothing about Russia that is unique and special and in the world that if it ceased to exist as a country, nothing massive bad would happen. There's nothing lost. All the little bits of what they call Russian culture would start being whatever culture they actually are, and it wouldn't be lost. Whatever they made before or produced, it's all produced or made somewhere else. And whatever they do in the world, wow, all that could go. The manner in which Russia is exerting its influence in Central Africa, I'd be happy to see the back of that. The absolute nefarious activity that they get up to inside the political systems of America or Britain or any of the European countries or even my country here in Australia, be very, very happy to see the back of that. And imagine how much better your life will be if you don't have Russia trying to foment a discord inside your country between you and somebody who doesn't look like you or think like you or came from somewhere else, whatever the reasons they're using in your country to try to foment discord, they're doing it. We see the evidence of them doing it everywhere. And wouldn't the world be better if that didn't happen? Wouldn't it be nice if Russia went away and we didn't see that anymore? I'd be actually yes, that would be a good thing if Russia went away and did that. And when you're talking about some of the stuff Russia gets involved in order to propagate its influence and control as it is over the world, the Jeffrey Epstein thing, which was clearly a Russian information operation and honey trap operation that started out with one pervert, but was quickly overtaken and facilitated by Russia. And therefore, all the exploitation of all the women that happened in that situation, that's Russia too. They own some of that. Jeffrey Epstein owns quite a lot of it as the originator, but every participant in it owns their bit, and Russia absolutely helped facilitate and propagate that network of pedophiles. It's clear in the evidence that they did. Known current FSB people involved with Jeffrey Epstein over long periods of time, and payments made for things which are unexplained is absolutely positively them being involved in facilitating a honey trap operation. That could go. If I never saw another one of these Epstein things, I'd be quite happy. I'd be quite happy to see the back of that. So there's nothing Russia's doing that's essential and good. And you could live without them for a period of time until they demonstrated that they were going to be a good member of society again, or embargo them. Why do we want to engage in Russia in the Olympics or business or resources? Just let them be themselves, because they're all caught up in their sovereignty, right? Oh, the sovereignty of Russia. We can't let these other people come over and invade us. Nobody's interested in invading Russia unless it's a means to end this war, which Ukraine has every right to do. But they're not going to invade and conquer Russia. Nobody wants Russia. The Russians don't want Russians. Listen to them. That's why they always want to go someplace else. They're not interested in hanging on to Russia, or nobody else is interested in hanging on to Russia any more than the Russians are. And so nobody's coming to threaten and take over Russia. So they need to understand what real sovereignty is. Sovereignty is living on your own with the means that you've got available to you and becoming a viable and sustainable government for the society in which you live. I'm not saying you have to become a liberal democracy. I'm not, or a presidential or a parliamentary or whatever. But you need to be a representative government that is taking in the means of production in your country and distributing the benefits of that production evenly enough to keep society wanting to have children and grow up and proceed through the thing. If you're doing that, that's the bare minimum. I obviously have a predilection for wanting to deal with liberal democracies, but who am I to tell Russia how to generate their own form of government? It's not up to me. It would be the height of hypocrisy of me to define what kind of government Russia has to have. Couldn't care less, other than the fact that I'd like all the Russians that I know to agree that they want that form of government, but they have to do some work themselves, and they haven't done that work yet. The next 30 years are going to be incredibly hard times for Russians, incredibly hard time. But I don't feel sorry for them one tiny little bit, and I'm not interested in helping them until they get along the path long enough to be able to demonstrate that they're a country that's approaching becoming essential, because they're the inessential country right now, but they keep trying to paint themselves. And if you can get something up in the Economist, you know that the editors will let it get through the Economist and be published, means they've took a look at it and, well, we don't really agree with that, but we're willing to accept critique it linguistically and logically. They didn't do their job. They were either bought off, bulldozed, bamboozled, whatever, because the arguments put forward here by this guy and the other Vatniks that I've heard that we make us need to be unduly worried about nuclear weapons if Russia breaks up into its component parts are missing it entirely. The only way for Russia to become a good country is for it to go through a massive, massive epiphany. This is why each and every one of these people that I come across that has something to say, because they're Russian, about Russia, I'm willing to hear them all out, but only up until for the first few minutes. If it doesn't start off with, we need to end this war and get the fuck out of Ukraine, and then carry on with the rest of it. If they don't have those two things to say because of they've reached the epiphany, I've got almost no time for them. But I did take the time to read this very complicated thing that this guy put in the Economist, because it so many people were looking at it and taking it so seriously that I said, all right, God damn it, I got to read it myself. And it's spurious arguments about something which is fundamentally, principally untrue. And the editors of the Economist should have left it out rather than accept it, or put a counterpoint into it rather than let it stand, because it is an argument in four or five parts, which, like their textbooks, has so many explanations for the war in Ukraine, like 15 or 16, but they totally miss the point. And by the time they're done reading the 15 or 16 things, you're just kind of like, all right, well, whatever. You're entitled to your view. No, you're not. You are not entitled to your view, because your view about this war ending, with anything, a necessity of this war ending, with Ukraine, with Russia intact, and as a sovereign nation by their definition, meaning it has rights to be revered and influence its neighbors is absolutely, totally fucking bullshit and needs to be called out at the very front. Sorry for that massive rant, Yenny, but, well, it had been building up for about 12 hours.